In this unit, we're going to address the somewhat technical topic of representation. Now, when you signed up for this module, you probably expected something about brains and something about perception. We're covering lots of things you expect, but I'm not sure that you expected representation, whatever the hell that is, to feature. Representation is a term that's used in a bewildering variety of ways and yet lies at the core of the concerns of cognitive science. Cognitive science is concerned with the relationship of knowing between a knower and the known. Now, there are many ways to think of that. We could turn it into a verb. Knowing is a verb as a kind of activity. Frequently, when we try to understand something, we begin by casting it instead as a noun, knowledge. And there's no guarantee that we can arrive at a sensible, stable definition of such a complicated topic. In other words, that knowledge will turn out to be one thing or another thing. But discussion around representation seeks to find various ways of talking about knowledge and knowing in various ways. It's asking about the form of knowledge. We've encountered several different traditions within cognitive science. One of the problems that lurks at the core of all the questions we're asking is the problem of dualism, insisting that mind and world are somehow separate. We seem to be both committed to this and to recognize at the same time that it's a very, very problematic way of describing ourselves. But if we're going to place minds in brains, in heads, then we need some kind of a story of how the mind comes to know the world. And most of those stories involve, as we've seen, the creation of representations of the world, or the hypothesizing of patterns of activity or goings-on in the brain that are about the world. Now, the about relationship is not a simple one. It can be unpacked in various ways. And in order to begin to get familiar with this topic, we're going to leave such difficult philosophical questions behind and work with representations we're familiar with. Maps. Let's just walk through some things we know about maps. So we're doing this virtually. Even in class, we do this virtually because I put up a screen like that and I say, that's Salt Lake City. And of course, it's not. It's an image of Salt Lake City, right? It's a picture. It's a photograph of Salt Lake City. It's not Salt Lake City. I've never been to Salt Lake City. I believe it exists. A photograph gives me more reason to believe it exists. Let's assume for the present purposes that Salt Lake City actually exists. That's not it. That's a map of Salt Lake City. It's something completely different from Salt Lake City. But in a very real sense, it's about Salt Lake City. There's certain things you can do with the map that only make sense if they relate in a very particular way to the actual Salt Lake City. This map shows the layout of various buildings, roads, a little bit of topographical information about the mountains to the top right, and not much else. Now, there's more than one way to draw a map of Salt Lake City. In fact, there's no single way or even best way to draw a map of Salt Lake City. Here's another map of Salt Lake City. It's at a different scale, and all the detail of the previous map has now been shrunk down. If you look at this map, you'll see a 5-pointed star, a white star in a black circle. And that stands for Salt Lake City. So that's also about Salt Lake City, but clearly in a very different way from the last map. This map has lots of information as well. Some of the topographical information now for a larger area. Got the names of all the surrounding towns and so on. And for good measure, here's a third map of Salt Lake City. We could do this indefinitely. Obviously, there's very many maps of Salt Lake City. Now, in what way are these maps about Salt Lake City? Well, the answer is in various ways. There are various ways in which elements of this map relate to Salt Lake City. So in this map, for example, the map makers have kindly provided us with a legend. So they explain the use of various symbols. They tell us what the red roads or the red lines and the green lines and the yellow lines on the map means, and they provide some additional information. So they're making explicit some of the information that is contained in this map, and that is about Salt Lake City. And some of that information is really easy to get at, as it were. It's very explicit. So the names of places is spelled out completely explicitly, very clearly. There's other information in this map that's not as easy to get at, but it's there nonetheless. So if we wanted to measure the distance between two cities or towns on this map, we might take a piece of string and lay out the road we would follow, and then take our piece of string and put it against the scale, and there's a scale conveniently given in the legend. And then we could do a little bit of calculation, and we would know how far the distance on the ground is based on what we did on the map. So we got that information from the map, but it was a bit of work. It wasn't that easy. So you can see that the information in this map relates to the real Salt Lake City in various ways. Some of these ways are symbolic, as in the use of an airplane to stand for an airport. Some of these ways are not symbolic but metric. That is, the measurements of that piece of string relate to measurements on the ground in a principled law-like fashion. And another thing to note about all these maps, is that they cannot hope to capture the entirety of Salt Lake City. There's tons, one might say almost everything about Salt Lake City is not on these maps. These maps give you no information about the sounds and smells, the history, the political character, the recipes, the cultural life, the music of Salt Lake City. There's lots of things to say about Salt Lake City, and these maps convey some information, and they do so in a variety of different ways. Now, maps make use of symbols, and symbols are interesting things to think about. They stand in correspondence to something else, and we might ask what that relationship is. The relationship of a symbol to the thing it stands for is usually not like that piece of string that gave us a metric account of distances on the ground. Symbols are designed to be easy to read, so the two airplanes here don't look anything like airports, but if you encountered them on a map, you would know that they stood for airports. We're very good at dealing with symbols. A 5-pointed star in a black circle is probably a representation of a city that you've never met before. And yet it didn't seem terribly confusing. We sort of know why the map makers chose just to use one symbol to stand for all the detail of Salt Lake City. Symbols have sometimes what we might call an iconic character. The airplanes above there do, and the oil can there also has an iconic character in that they sort of look like something which is sort of associated with the thing that the symbol is about. Interestingly, the oil can shown here, which is a conventional representation found in the dashboard of cars to alert you to an oil failure in your engine, refers to, or looks like its iconicity comes from an old-fashioned kind of oil can that you won't find in a contemporary garage. And some symbols just do not look like anything at all. They have no iconic character whatsoever. So the red circle with a line through it, what does that stand for? Well, it's kind of a generic sign for prohibition. You can add things to that, and you can make up signs for no fishing, no walking, no dogs, and so on. In fact, here's a Russian sign saying no prohibitions. Symbols are not the only way that something can be about something that's not present. And that's what we're concerned with. We're concerned with something that we got a form we can look at, which bears an unquestionable or an intelligible relationship to something which is not present. And so we can say it's about something which is not present. Well, here are two forms that one might encounter. On the top, the marks of lipstick on glass. On the bottom, the imprint of a hand on a piece of clay. And they also stand in correspondence to something which is not here. The lips on the glass speak of a past event. The hand imprint, likewise, could be read as being about a specific event in which a hand was pushed into clay. Notice, once more, not everything about the original event is present in this trace, this imprint. What there is allows us to gain some information about the previous thing. Notice also that the relationship of the mark that we're looking at and the previous event is not established by convention. It's not a matter of mere convention. There is a causal chain we can trace back that has to do with the movement of bodies in space and their encounters with objects. So the imprint also has this character, that because it lies in this causal chain, its properties, its metric properties, its shape is not accidental, not conventional. And even if we were, let's say, to take that piece of clay while it was still wet, and we could stretch it, and we could compress some parts of it, we could stretch it so that the fingers get longer and the hand gets narrower. And as long as we don't tear the clay, it still stands in that unbroken relationship to the original event. And there is what we call a topological mapping from the hand on clay as it once was to our even distorted piece of clay here. And we'll encounter that again. So from the source event to this trace or imprint that we have now, there's some process of translation in which some properties are preserved and some are lost and others are modified. So we can distort the clay and that modifies some. There's enough left here so we can tell the nature of the event. Someone kissed a sheet of glass, someone pushed a hand into clay, and there's lots of information that's lost. We have no information here about the gender of the person or why these things happened, for example. So those maps and imprints provide us with a range of ways of thinking how something that we're looking at in the present can be about something which is not here. The word representation is often used in a way that is distinguished from those imprints and traces and has more in common with the symbols and icons on the map. On these views, we can say that something represents something else if it stands in correspondence to that thing and it plays a role within a system because it has that relationship of correspondence. Now, this correspondence is only possible if there's some kind of ecosystem within which the icon or symbol can play that role. So if I had merely shown you a 5-pointed star in a black circle, without the context of maps and without warming you up and telling you we were in Salt Lake City, you would have no clue what it means. So symbols function, as it were, within an ecosystem of signs, and we live within many such. The letters and texts that we use are one such ecosystem. But walk outside your house, walk down the road, and you'll see an ecosystem of signs that are there to guide traffic and regulate where pedestrians go, where cars go. And there are signs that warn you what you can do and what you can't do. And there are different systems. So the system of road signs is different from the system of alphabetic letters, for example. But each of these systems has a certain internal consistency, and they are, of course, established by convention. And that differentiates them from those translations, from the imprint or trace, which we could follow all the way back to the source event. So there's several ways now in which something that we're looking at right now can be about something which is not present. When we're dealing with symbols and icons of this sort, the relationship can be entirely arbitrary, or it can have some non-arbitrary elements in it. So the Greek letter pi, for example, has been appropriated by mathematicians, taken out of its ecosystem of Greek texts, and re-entered into a different system of mathematical equations, mathematical notation. It stands within this system for a particular number, 3.141, blah, 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 blah. That number was known to the Greeks, but they did not use that letter for it. So the meaning of a symbol depends on this system within which it functions. There's two prohibition signs there, and they feature a slightly iconic element, which tells you that what's being prohibited here is fishing. But you can see there's no one way to indicate that. So this is not a straightforward drawing or photograph of someone fishing. What needs to be conveyed is the purpose of the sign maker. Now you can see that there's a great deal of arbitrariness in how these things stand for anything at all. And some elements may be non-arbitrary, as with these iconic elements that indicate visually fishing. So that's our brief introduction to how things can be about things. Things we're looking at can be about things that are not here. Representation will take us to some strange places in the subsequent videos.